1965, there was Frank Lanterman carried Assembly Bill 691 that established 2 regional centers, one in LA and one in the San Francisco area. They were both run through, one was run through Children's Hospital down in LA. Those centers basically still exist to this day. They have different names and they're freestanding nonprofits. But they do, one is now the Golden Gate Regional Center and the other one is Frank D. Lanterman Regional Center. And again, because everything's fluid, now let's remember now we had about $500,000 being spent on about 600 people in the community. We were still spending lots of money in institutional care. Well, you know, it doesn't take long for the word to get passed along the state. And other people said, well, if they can have that down there, why can't we have it? And by 1969, there was another major set of amendments. And it, in essence, established the 21 regional centers, Alta being one of them. Interestingly enough, although the state of California's population has grown significantly, the structure of the regional center system has not. In terms of, there's still 21 centers. There have been 21 centers in 1969, and there are 21 centers today. A few have changed names. We won't talk about why. But the same basic structure is there. Anyway, 21 regional centers, 73, originally only for people with mental retardation. 73 came in cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, and this other amorphous 5th category that everybody likes so much that we love to go to fair hearing on because it's the place you get to have the biggest arguments. Notice, no autism, wasn't here yet. Kind of fell in, oh, it is, you know, it actually came in as a separate item. It actually came in. But again, the act was changing, the names were changing. It's interesting, if you've worked in government very long, what you find out is every so many years you go through the consolidation effort, and then every couple years later you go through the breakup effort. It's like marriage. Well, I know some people who go through that all the time, but I must be talking about my own brother. But departments have been put together, taken apart, put together, and taken apart, and that was the year that they actually pulled the Department of Health apart, which was huge. And one of the departments that came out of that was the Department of Developmental Services. A lot of people say, well, is that a good idea? It gets some attention. It's not part of a bigger place. Well, but I will tell you, I worked there when it was part of a bigger place, and you got no attention. So you just have to sort of pick, as Terry Dio is fond of saying, you want to be a little fish in a really big sea, and actually it works that way for the department. On the whole, even though things are looking bad, now they have done better than most of their fellow public health and social delivery systems. Anyway, the law sets out the rights. Seems simple. You'd be amazed at people who still say to me, do they have rights? Yeah. You know? I think one of the things that's important to understand is that, and if any of you get a chance to spend any time with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a treaty that shortly will start to be considered by the U.S. Senate, guess what? It's like they came up with a new idea, rights. You know, so yeah, we could have written that part of it for you. But basically a basic set of rights. It created the regional centers, it created the concept of individual program planning. It's been named several things over time, but it's the same concept. It basically created the responsibility for coordinating services and supports for folks with disabilities and their families. And unfortunately, all of that comes along with paperwork trappings that the regional center staff finds so fun. And I'm sure the providers aren't finding it much more fun than the staff are. The news about this act, though, is it's the only one in the United States that exists. And And when people say, well, I heard that everybody in Colorado gets blah, 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 I would suggest, if you're told that, to find out how many people in Colorado are actually getting services. This investment in California was 100% general funds for years, which meant the taxpayers' dollars paid right here in California. It's only been about the last 10 or so years where there's been a much higher run for an investment of federal dollars in the system. The commitment that was made by the state of California, regardless of the size of it at the moment or what the other issues were, was that the state of California took responsibility. Not the federal government, not the counties, but the state of California. That is the entitlement. You won't find the words entitlement. I know there's a great slide in here. You won't actually find the words entitlement in the Lanterman Act. It doesn't exist. What really set the entitlement was this decision right here. It defined, it put the word entitlement onto what was in the Lanterman Act. So if people say, well, I don't see that. I Googled it, and or I did a search and stuff. It's not there. It isn't there. It's not meant to be there because it is the total of the service system, and it's the basic right to have access to services and supports to achieve outcomes. I think that sometimes we get a little confused about what those services and supports are about. And a lot of people think, well, I just should get a laundry list and I should go down them, and today I want this, and no, I'm not doing dolphin therapy for you, Jasmine. But the fact is, they're supposed to achieve outcomes. And I think we often forget that in the planning process. It gets very hard to remember when you're being faced with reductions and things like that, that there is a purpose to this process. Anyway, the state of California accepts responsibility, an obligation which it must discharge. That's the battle cry. Therefore, the Lanterman Act establishes an entitlement to services, but the real entitlement was confirmed or actually defined. But basically, the word entitlement's not in the law. You won't find it there. It's the total package of the law and the court decision, which at times has been challenged but never overruled, that set the term, the entitlement, and the obligation. The California is obligated to establish an array of services and supports to meet the needs and choices. Let me really emphasize the word choices here. That is probably, in my mind, the hardest challenge of the system, is how to balance needs and choices against money, because we don't have an unlimited budget, even though we would like to. We did one time, by the way. When I was in the system years and years ago, we got to June, we all had lots of money, the regional center had a ton of money. I'd go over and say, okay, I've got 6 people who need to go here, 5 people want to go there, 10 people want to go here. Oh, the camp's full. We filled up the camp. We had lots of money. It was a great deal. Those days are over. The problem is there's still some folks in the system that remember those days and do have a hard time understanding that even then there were money limitations. We just didn't have 250,000 people that we were serving, which is about what the number is scheduled to be this next year. It grows at about 7%, 6 to 7% a year. So regardless of all our good interventions and better medical care, et cetera, we still are growing at 6 to 7% per year of people who are identified and meet the state definition, which, by the way, is much more narrow than the federal definition that I work under. The state definition cuts off the age of onset at 18. The federal definition runs at age 22. The federal definition is functional in nature. The state definition is categorical. Even though the state definition has some functional criteria to look at, it still has a categorical process to it. Anyway, enable a person to approximate the pattern of everyday living available to those people without disabilities of the same age, live, play, recreate, procreate the same as you and I do. empower them to make choices in all their lives. I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges we're all having, because empowerment isn't just telling you, as you all know, it's sort of like voting. Yeah, we all have the right to vote. Well, at least most of us do. But do we know what we're voting about? Are we informed, and do we know? And I got to say, after looking at the last ballot, I didn't have the foggiest idea what I was voting about, so I just voted no on everything. No. Please don't tell my bosses that. They actually think I have half a brain. Anyway, just running back to the court decision, basically there was, guess what? There were budget deficits in 1985, nothing like we have today. If they had seen a $25 billion deficit, I don't even think the budget was $25 billion at that time, they probably have apoplexy, and now we just go, oh yeah, $25 billion, yeah, okay. But anyway, there were cost-saving measures put in. Does this sound familiar? This has now happened several years in a row. And in that case, the issue was taken to the Supreme Court, and basically the court is the one that said that it defined this entitlement, thus the state's obligation. And we live on this to this day. The good news is this is very powerful when you go before the legislature and folks like that, because even though they might want to go in and slash and burn the way they've done mental health and some other service systems, this one has still fared better than any other social service system in California, at least in my history. Again, talking about how the development of the IPP and who determines, it's not that someone tells you that's what it is, it's then your guys can talk about the IPP. And if I'm running on, you need to let me know. But basically that it's implementing the IPP that is developed with the family and families if appropriate and consumers certainly. And by the way, in 1985 it talked about IPP, but it really wasn't even still envisioning that sort of person-centered planning approach. All of that came along actually much later, and it has evolved over time. Of course, the rights are in there, the right to treatment and rehabilitation services and supports in the least restrictive environment. And again, though, let me point out, it doesn't just stop here. That's the easy part. It basically says they should achieve something. And I think that's been one of our biggest challenges, is that we may or may not be achieving these outcomes. And it's very hard for a system to move itself from point to point and make those types of shifts. But I want to tell you that the law years ago envisioned not that just that you could have a service, but that the service would do something. Now, how realistic is it for any given person to achieve all of that? Well, that's why we do things individually. That's why we talk to people. Because what is least restrictive for me may not be for the person who lives next door to me. As a matter of fact, I would prefer that they be locked up right now, but I haven't figured out how to make it happen. But basically, whatever you do, personal liberty of the individual. Well, okay, so we do have some people in the system who have their personal liberties diminished by their own actions and through the court system, but they still have some personal liberties. It's not like a total 100%. So this just sets out basically where you ought to go and where you ought to be heading, but it doesn't tell you what the end is. The end is what works for an individual and what you can do to provide them the supports to get to their preferred end. And it doesn't always work 100%.